In the grand theatres of power during the 1930s and 1940s, Adolf Hitler projected an image of absolute devotion, not to a woman, but to Germany itself. He once declared that he was married to the German people, and this strange vow became part of his cult of personality. To millions he appeared as a solitary, almost monk-like figure, consumed by politics, war, and ideology. But hidden in the shadows of this performance was Eva Braun, the woman who for over a decade was his closest companion, and yet one of the most invisible figures in the history of the Third Reich. Eva Braun was not a wife, nor an openly acknowledged partner. She was concealed in private estates, in guarded rooms, and most often at Hitler's mountain retreat, the Berghof. There, she lived in quiet luxury, but with little freedom, cut off from the outside world. To the public, she did not exist. Even many Nazi officials barely knew her presence. This secrecy was not accidental. It was carefully maintained. And it is here that one of history's most unsettling rumors begins, that Hitler and Eva's relationship was not merely hidden, but disturbingly hollow. From early on, gossip spread that Hitler avoided any real intimacy with Eva. The young woman, vibrant and energetic, appeared more like an ornament in his life than a lover. Guests who saw her at the Berghof described her as cheerful but strangely lonely, forced to entertain herself with photography, fashion, and trivial hobbies, while Hitler immersed himself in long political conversations with his inner circle. The imbalance was striking. She was present, yet invisible, near him, but never truly close. It was this dynamic that gave birth to the so-called Virginity Myth. Whispers claimed that Eva remained untouched by Hitler, that their relationship lacked the physical closeness one would expect from a couple together for more than a decade. Some dismissed this as propaganda designed to mock Hitler's masculinity, but others believed it reflected something far darker about his psychology. Why, after all, would a man keep a mistress so carefully hidden, only to treat her like a prisoner in gilded isolation? The secrecy surrounding Eva's life fueled endless speculation. Did Hitler fear that intimacy would tarnish his image as the leader who belonged only to Germany? Or did his own fears, dysfunctions, and obsessions make closeness impossible? To this day, historians argue, but the fact remains. Eva Braun lived for years in the strange twilight between partner and prisoner, her role reduced to silence and shadows. And so, while Hitler stood before the world as a man married to his Reich, Eva Braun stood behind locked doors, a silent companion whose life was defined not by love, but by absence. It is here in this absence that the myth begins, the myth that she was never truly his lover at all. Eva Braun's world was one of contradictions, comfort without freedom, luxury without recognition, and intimacy without closeness. To outsiders, her life might have seemed enviable, fine clothes, elegant surroundings, and access to the most powerful man in Europe. But those who looked more closely saw something else entirely, a life of seclusion that bordered on imprisonment. From the moment she entered Hitler's orbit as a teenager working in the studio of his personal photographer, Heinrich Hoffmann, Eva was drawn into a carefully constructed cage. Her contact with the outside world shrank year by year. Friends from her youth were discouraged or outright forbidden. Letters and phone calls were monitored. Trips beyond Hitler's estates were rare, and when they did occur, she was always under watch. Hitler controlled not only her movements, but also her role in his life. She was to remain invisible to the German public. At the Berghof in Bavaria, Eva occupied her own quarters, separate from Hitler's. Guests described her as a ghostly presence, often glimpsed on the terrace, smiling politely, but rarely invited to participate in the serious conversations of generals, ministers, or party officials. She was tolerated, but never central, more like a piece of furniture in Hitler's carefully staged household. Even in the moments when she appeared at his side, Eva was kept deliberately at a distance. Official photographers were ordered to avoid capturing her in frames with Hitler. She was almost never present at rallies, speeches, or state events. For years, the German people had no idea she even existed. While other dictators flaunted their wives or mistresses as symbols of virility and power, Hitler chose the opposite. He concealed Eva entirely, as if ashamed of her or unwilling to acknowledge a normal human attachment. Inside this gilded isolation, Eva occupied her tie, me with trivialities. She filled albums with photographs, practiced gymnastics, and obsessed over fashion and hairstyles. To some, these pastimes appeared shallow. To others, they were acts of survival for a woman starved of meaning. Deprived of genuine intimacy, she sought control in the small things left to her, her appearance, her hobbies, and the fleeting joys of youth. But always, her existence was framed by one unchanging reality. She was kept apart, both from the public and from the man whose presence defined her life. Those few who interacted with her often described Eva as light-hearted, playful, even charming. But beneath the laughter was a gnawing loneliness. Diaries and notes hint at a woman aware of her invisibility, struggling against despair. Twice she attempted suicide during her early years with Hitler, acts that reveal the desperation of someone trapped in a life that looked like privilege from the outside, but felt like a prison from within. Eva Braun was not just secluded, she was erased. And in that erasure, the rumors only grew. If she was hidden so thoroughly, perhaps there was a darker reason why. If Eva Braun's life was shaped by seclusion, it was further defined by the countless rules Hitler imposed on her existence. These rules were not merely the controlling habits of a jealous man, they were the strict regulations of a dictator extending his iron grip from a nation to a single woman. In Eva's world, almost nothing was hers to decide. Her diet was dictated by Hitler's own obsessions. A strict vegetarian, he insisted that Eva follow his example, often ridiculing her if she expressed interest in richer meals or sweets. At dinner tables, she was expected to smile politely, laugh at his jokes, and never interrupt the endless monologues he delivered to his generals and inner circle. She could sit near him, but she was never truly included. Even her appearance was subject to his will. Hitler had strong opinions on how women should look and behave, and Eva's wardrobe reflected this. She was forbidden to wear certain styles or experiment too boldly with fashion. He preferred her in traditional, modest dresses, with natural hairstyles and little makeup. She complied, though her private photo albums reveal a woman who longed for glamour and self-expression, a woman who secretly tried on the kinds of clothes Hitler disapproved of, capturing herself in playful, daring poses for the camera. Her social life was equally constrained. She could not travel freely, could not host gatherings of her own, and could not mingle with men outside Hitler's circle. Friends from her youth slipped away as the years passed, until she had no real companionship beyond the hand-picked women of the Nazi elite, wives and mistresses who, like her, existed in the margins of their partner's political world. Even among them, she was seen as a minor figure, tolerated but not respected. But the most suffocating restriction was silence. Eva was forbidden from speaking publicly about her relationship with Hitler. She could not acknowledge her role, could not claim a title, could not even dream of being a wife in the open. To the outside world, she was a non-person. To Hitler, she was someone who existed in the shadows, useful as a private companion, but erased from the stage of history. This strangest of arrangements raised inevitable questions. Why would a man maintain such a relationship only to deny its existence? Why bind a woman so tightly with rules, yet refuse her the recognition of being his partner? To many historians, these restrictions reveal not only Hitler's paranoia about his public image, but also his deeply conflicted view of intimacy. By keeping Eva at a distance, he avoided both scandal and the vulnerability of true closeness. For Eva, however, the cost was devastating. Her life became a constant balancing act between obedience and despair, her identity slowly consumed by the endless restrictions of a man who treated her not as a lover, but as another possession. And in that control, the rumors deepened. Perhaps intimacy was not only forbidden, but impossible. Of all the whispers that surrounded Hitler and Eva Braun, none has been more unsettling or more enduring than the claim that their relationship was never consummated. For a man who demanded complete control over her life, the absence of intimacy seemed almost paradoxical. Yet this very absence became the foundation of one of history's strangest rumors, that Eva remained, until the very end, untouched. The origins of the rumor trace back to psychological profiles of Hitler compiled during the war. Allied intelligence agencies, desperate to understand the Führer's mind, collected testimonies from defectors, acquaintances, and even medical records. What emerged was a portrait of a man either unwilling or unable to engage in ordinary sexual relations. Reports suggested impotence, extreme aversion to physical intimacy, and even darker inclinations that could not be openly proven. Within this murky web of speculation, Eva Braun was described as more a symbolic ornament than a partner, a woman whose presence reassured Hitler's inner circle of his normalcy, while concealing the absence of real closeness. Eva herself seemed aware of this strange position. In private notes, she sometimes referred to her loneliness, her isolation, her role as something less than a wife. She had all the trappings of intimacy, the home, the gifts, the proximity, but not the act itself. She was, in essence, both a mistress and a stranger. This contradiction fed the whispers among those who glimpsed her life behind closed doors. The idea of her virginity was not simply about physicality. It was symbolic of Hitler's entire worldview. To some, it reflected his obsession with purity, control, and detachment from human weakness. He avoided alcohol, disdained smoking, and presented himself as disciplined and above earthly temptations. Sexual abstinence, whether real or performed, became another piece of the myth he built around himself. By denying Eva true intimacy, he denied vulnerability. But other darker interpretations linger. Some suggested Hitler's desires were twisted, that he sought not closeness but humiliation, that his interest in women was colored by psychological fears and fetishes. These stories, impossible to confirm, yet impossible to silence, only deepened the aura of abnormality around Eva's place in his life. For Eva, however, the result was the same. She lived not as a lover, but as a shadow. Her worth in Hitler's eyes seemed less about love and more about utility. A silent figure who provided companionship without ever demanding the rights of a partner. And so the rumor persisted, that she was not only hidden from the world, but hidden even from intimacy itself. The virginity myth was more than gossip. It was a reflection of the deepest unease about Hitler's private world, a world as cold, distant, and inhuman as the regime he built. And whether fact or invention, the rumor became part of the dark legend of Eva Braun, a woman who may never have been truly touched by the man she devoted her life to. The rumors about Eva Braun's untouched state cannot be separated from the broader portrait of Adolf Hitler's psychology. For all his public displays of dominance and control, there is strong evidence that in private, he recoiled from the very thing that defines most human relationships: intimacy. Hitler viewed sex not as an act of love or bonding, but as a potential source of weakness. To him, intimacy meant surrender, the loss of control that came when one opened themselves to another. And surrender, in Hitler's mind, was synonymous with humiliation. Obsessed with authority, power, and domination, he seemed incapable of reconciling those values with the vulnerability required in a partnership. For a man who demanded absolute obedience from an entire nation, the idea of equality within a relationship was unthinkable. Psychologists who studied him during the war argued that his avoidance of intimacy was rooted in profound insecurity. Some pointed to his strict and often abusive childhood, others to his failures as a young man, and still others to the trauma of war. Whatever the source, his adult life reflected a consistent pattern. Women were to be controlled, silenced, and kept at a distance. Their role was symbolic, never truly personal. Eva Braun became the most striking example of this pattern. Though she devoted herself entirely to him, he kept her hidden, denied her recognition, and offered her little in return. The suicide attempts she made in her early years with him were not merely cries for attention, but signs of a deep despair born from being close to someone who never let her truly in. Even among Hitler's closest circle, the lack of intimacy was apparent. His aides, secretaries, and guards observed his relationship with Eva and found it strangely lifeless. He was often cold, sometimes dismissive, rarely affectionate. Where other leaders flaunted the virility or paraded their wives, Hitler presented an image of sterile detachment, as though human closeness was beneath him. This fear of intimacy also dovetailed with his ideology. Hitler preached about purity, sacrifice, and devotion to the Reich above all else. Personal attachments in his mind threatened to distract from his destiny. To admit to human desires would be to admit he was mortal, fallible, and vulnerable, things his carefully constructed persona could never allow. Thus, Eva became both his companion and his sacrifice, a woman bound to him, yet denied the fulfillment of a true relationship. Historians still debate whether Hitler's fear was physical, psychological, or ideological, but the effect was the same. Eva Braun was forced into a role defined by absence. She was close enough to be controlled, but never close enough to be loved. And in this chilling distance, the myth of her untouched state only grew stronger, a mirror of Hitler's own inability to embrace the most basic expression of humanity. As the Third Reich collapsed in the spring of 1945, Adolf Hitler's carefully constructed world of control unraveled. Soviet artillery thundered through the ruins of Berlin. The city was in flames, and the once mighty Führer retreated into the claustrophobic underground corridors of his bunker. It was here, in those final days of chaos and despair, that Eva Braun re-emerged into his story, not as a lover in life, but as a companion in death. For years she had been hidden, erased, and denied. Yet in the bunker, surrounded by the crumbling remains of his empire, Hitler finally offered her the recognition he had withheld: marriage. On the night of April 29, 1945, in a dimly lit room, Eva and Adolf were wed in a brief, almost perfunctory civil ceremony. Witnesses described it as strangely hollow, lacking joy, warmth, or even the pretense of romance. For Eva, it was a title she had long craved, but it came at the cost of knowing the world around them was seconds from ending. The marriage was not followed by celebration, but by a death pact. Less than 40 hours later, on April 30th, Hitler and Eva retreated into a private room. According to accounts, she sat calmly, dressed with care, as if preparing for a final portrait. Hitler, pale and trembling, prepared his pistol. Together, they took their lives. She by swallowing cyanide, he by a gunshot to the head. Their bodies were dragged outside, doused in petrol, and set aflame as Soviet forces closed in. Even in this final act, the rumors persisted. Some questioned whether the marriage was an act of love or merely a final gesture of control, Hitler granting Eva recognition only when it no longer mattered. Others pointed to the speed and coldness of the event, suggesting that intimacy had no place even in their last hours together. The question lingered: did Hitler finally acknowledge Eva as a partner, or did he simply use her one last time to maintain the image of devotion before the world collapsed? For Eva, the final days revealed both her loyalty and her tragedy. She had opportunities to escape, to flee Berlin, to save herself, but she refused. She chose instead to remain with the man who had kept her in shadows for more than a decade. Whether this choice was born from love, desperation, or the erasure of her own identity, we cannot know. But it sealed her fate forever as the woman who died beside Adolf Hitler. And so, the story of Eva Braun ended as it had begun, defined by absence. Even in the moment of marriage, even in the act of death, she remained a figure cloaked in mystery, her relationship with Hitler never fully revealed, never fully understood. To history, she was both his wife and his ghost. The story of Eva Braun ends in the ashes of Berlin, but her myth has only grown stronger with time. Historians continue to argue over the details of her life with Hitler, but one rumor persists above all: the so-called Virginity Myth. It is whispered in biographies, debated in psychological studies, and retold in countless dark corners of history. The belief that Eva lived and died as the companion of Adolf Hitler without ever being truly his lover. Why has this myth endured for so long? Part of the reason lies in Hitler himself. He presented an image of a man detached from ordinary human needs, claiming devotion only to Germany and avoiding the displays of intimacy common to other leaders. His secrecy left behind a void, and into that void speculation rushed. The absence of proof became proof itself, feeding the narrative that something was disturbingly abnormal in his private life. For others, the myth carries symbolic weight. It portrays Hitler as a man so consumed by ideology, power, and obsession with control that he stripped away even the most basic expression of human connection. To believe that Eva remained untouched is to believe that Hitler was not merely cruel as a dictator, but incapable of ordinary love as a human being. The idea fits the monstrous image of him, a man whose relationships, like his politics, were marked by coldness, control, and fear. But perhaps the most haunting reason the myth survives is Eva herself. She left behind no children, no memoir, and only fragments of diaries and photographs. Her silence, whether forced or chosen, ensures that her story will always be incomplete. Did she suffer quietly under the weight of neglect? Did she accept her role willingly, or cling to the hope of recognition until the very end? Was she a victim, a loyal partner, or something in between? The truth lies buried with her in the ruins of the Reich. And so, the virginity myth remains unsolved, a mixture of rumor, speculation, and symbolism. Whether fact or invention, it has become part of the dark legend of Adolf Hitler's private world, casting a shadow not only on him, but on the woman who gave her life to him in silence. In the end, Eva Braun is remembered less for who she was than for what she represented. The ghostly mistress of a dictator, erased in life, erased in death, and remembered only through the disturbing question that has never been answered. Was she ever truly his?